laid down by the Greeks, famously Euclid in his Elements, formulated axiomatically what we still teach at school as the geometry, the Euclidean geometry. And as you probably know from school, there are 4 axioms and the 5th one about parallel lines that somehow stood apart, and mathematicians for more than 1,000 years tried to do something with it to no avail until the 19th century, where came first the realization that you can actually construct geometries that are not constrained by this postulate of parallel lines from Euclidean geometry, and you can create other types of geometries that are given the name non-Euclidean. But it also created towards the second half of the 19th century this kind of unhealthy situation when different people worked on different geometries. It was not clear actually how to define a geometry and how they're related to each other. So it was clear that some kind of new approach, a paradigm shift was necessary, and this new idea came from Felix Klein in 1872. So he was also one of the founders of what we nowadays call group theory, and he proposed the radically new concept of considering geometry from the perspective of group theory. So essentially considering geometry as a definition of a space plus some group of transformation that acts on geometric shapes and then study their properties, asking what kind of properties remain unchanged or invariant under these transformations. And famously, this new idea that entered the history of mathematics as the Erlangen program was given in a talk that he was requested to give his inaugural lecture at the University of Erlangen, where he was appointed as a professor when he was only 23 years of age. So that's, I think, even by modern standards, is quite remarkable feat. So basically what he showed is that if you consider the classical Euclidean geometry, then it arises from the Euclidean group. So you study invariants with respect to rigid motions, translations, rotations, and deflections, but you can make the group larger. You can consider, for example, affine or projective transformations. And he also was the first one, together with Eugenio Beltrami, who managed to unify different non-Euclidean geometries that existed at that time, in particular hyperbolic geometry. That was the first non-Euclidean geometry that was constructed. So this idea was really transformational in geometry. It took quite some time to unify it with Riemannian geometry, about 50 years. But it also had a very big impact on mathematics in general, more culturally, but also in the field of physics, where in the beginning of the 20th century came the realization that you can apply the same principles, the idea of symmetry and the idea of invariance, to actually derive the laws of physics from these foundations. And famously, the theorem of Andy Neutrath, who proved that you can derive conservation laws mathematically. For example, conservation of energy, that before that was only an experimental law, could be derived from the symmetry of time. And these ideas appear to be very powerful, so Weil himself proposed what was called gauge invariance, that evolved in theoretical physics to what we nowadays call the standard theory, and this is more or less how we understand physics today. So there are a few things that do not fit into this picture, but physicists like distinguishing between external symmetries of the space-time, right? So what is called the Poincaré group that gives rise to the Minkowski geometry of the relativity theory, and the symmetries of the quantum fields that give rise to different forces or different interactions of particles. And it was formulated very strongly and very laconically by Philip Anderson that it's only slightly overstating to say that physics is the study of symmetry. So you can ask the question, of course, what does it have to do with deep learning of graphs, or deep learning in particular? And the answer is that we have a similar situation to what happened to geometry in the field of deep learning. So many different neural network architectures that were developed or emerged in the last decades from different considerations, or for different types of problems, or for different types of data. Like convolutional neural networks were conceived for image analysis and computer vision. Recurrent neural networks were developed for time series and temporal data analysis, and so on and so forth. And apparently there is no unifying framework or common denominator to these methods, and this is one of the reasons why deep learning is considered kind of a collection of tricks and hacks rather than a real science. So we try to challenge this picture by providing a unifying framework in the spirit of the Erlangen program, and this is what we call geometric deep learning. So trying to use principles of geometry to analyze, to derive new architectures, And if you consider the machine learning problem in the simple setting, right, supervised learning, you can think of it, some physicists would say, so this is just glorified curve fitting, right? So it's a function interpolation and extrapolation problem, right? So you can view it from the standpoint of approximation theory as you're given a function, right? And you are given a few samples of this function. So think of classical example of classifying cats and dogs, right? So you have high-dimensional inputs, the images of these animals, and then a function that outputs 1 or 0, right? And you can try to represent this function to capture it through some black box, and for decades we know what we can put in this box, right? These are artificial neural networks, like this one, the perceptron, that was developed already in the 50s by Frank Rosenblatt, and we know about these architectures that they are universal approximations. So if you just connect 2 layers of perceptron, you can approximate any function, any continuous function to any desired degree of accuracy, right? So basically, it can represent a very wide class of functions. Now, of course, if you come from the perspective of approximation theory, you can say, wait a second, but I have infinitely many functions that I can pass through a finite number of points. So what mathematicians usually do in these cases, they introduce some assumptions about these functions, which are called regularity, right? So you want some kind of nicely behaving functions. And in approximation theory, there are standard classes of regularity, such as Lipschitz continuity. The problem with these kind of standard notions of regularity is that they don't scale well with dimension. So if I give you very well-behaved functions, Lipschitz continuous functions, and I start increasing the dimension, right, and ask the very simple question, how many samples do I need to take to achieve approximation error of epsilon, you will see that very quickly the answer will grow bigger than the number of particles in the universe, right? So it is exponential in the number of dimensions. And in machine learning, unfortunately, we need to deal with very high dimensional problems, so even very tiny MNIST images are almost 1,000 dimensions, right? So basically, the number of, in the example of cats and dogs, the number of cats and dogs that you will need to see or to show to the neural network will be more than the number of atoms in the universe. So there are not sufficient number of animals around to do this training. So, and you can also see it that somehow we throw away, if we treat images just as high-dimensional vectors, we throw away a lot of structure, because if I show you this example of a digit that is shifted by just 1 pixel, if we just treat it as a vector, it changes dramatically as input into the simple-minded neural network. And we need to show a lot of examples of shifted digits in order to train the network to recognize it as the same class, right? And this is what we call, in modern deep learning terminology, data augmentation. So what happened in the 70s or early 80s was a new class of architectures that were the first, you could call them geometric architectures, that initially were inspired by neuroscience, such as the neocognitron of Fukushima, and then famously the classical architectures, convolutional architectures of Jan LeCun, that use the idea from the way that the neurons in the brain, in the visual cortex of the human brain, are connected to do what is, again, in deep learning terminology, is called local weight sharing. So you don't have a fully connected network, you have weights that are shared across the image, and it was motivated again by these problems of object recognition, that no matter where the object is located in the image, you still want to recognize it as the same class. And this fits into this blueprint of geometric deep learning, because we don't need to treat images as high-dimensional vectors, we need to treat them as data that lives on some low-dimensional geometric domains, such as grids or planes, in this case, of images. And then we can describe the structure, the geometric properties of the domain through a symmetry group. And the symmetry group, in this case, is the group of translations. It acts on the data that lives on the domain through some representation. So in case of images, it's just a shift operator. And then we have functions that take as input these signals living on our geometric domain. And these functions must respect the symmetry in some way. And this some way will be what we call invariance and equivariance. I guess in yesterday's keynote of Max Welling, we heard more about this. So I will not go much into more details, but this is the general blueprint. So we have a domain, a symmetry group that is associated with it, signals that live on the domain, and the corresponding representation of the symmetry, and then functions that are either invariant or equivariant with respect to this group. And you can see that convolutional neural networks are one example, right, where the group is translations, and then convolution is actually a linear operation that is equivariant with respect to translation. So you can define convolution axiomatically, so you can discover convolutions from these basic constraint of symmetry, that's the only linear equivariant that emerges from the translation symmetry group. Another example that would be interesting for us today, talking about graphs, are graph neural networks. So graph neural networks operate on domains that have graph structure, and there the group that is associated with the graph is the permutation group. It comes from the fact that we don't have canonical ordering of the nodes of the graph, and then as we'll see, the permutation equivariant or invariant functions are implemented through message passing. And you can see that this principle of geometric deep learning can be applied to different domains, whether it's graphs, whether it's meshes, or whether it's more general homogeneous spaces, or some maybe more exotic things like manifolds and other geometric objects. And you can show that many known architectures that are popular in the domain of deep learning can actually be derived from these formations. So not only that, but this blueprint also allows you to create new architectures. One of them, for example, equivariant transformers or equivariant graph neural networks that have become extremely popular recently in the context of protein design, like AlphaFold from DeepMind, or molecular modeling. And again, I think Max mentioned it in his talk yesterday. So we'll be talking about graphs, and I don't think that I need to convince you, this audience, that graphs are interesting. They are a very ubiquitous mathematical abstraction for systems of pairwise relations and interactions. You can apply graphs to model things from very tiny scale, like molecules, to very large scales, like social networks. And the problems that we can consider in the context of learning on graphs are of three types. These could be graph regression or graph classification. So I give you a graph that, for example, represents a molecule, and I would like to predict its physical or chemical properties. So this is a very typical problem in virtual drug screening and drug design. So you want, instead of doing experiments in the lab, you want to do them on a computer. You can do node classification. So again, in social networks like Twitter or Facebook, you would like to, for example, predict which users of the network are behaving badly, right? Spammers, for example. So you would like to assign some labels to these nodes. And then the problem of link prediction. So you want to infer